Hey everyone, this is Mike, and today I wanted to talk about how I got kind of into Final Fantasy XIV and kind of how everything started, because Final Fantasy is one of those games that it took a very long time for me to get into it, but once I finally did get into the game, it was also one of the only games that I've been able to play for years on end, and it's also the game that I've got the most playtime in out of all of the games that I've played so far as well. So that's why I kind of want to talk about it, because it's a little bit of a difficult game to get into, especially right now for some newer players as well. Mainly because of how A Realm Reborn works, because A Realm Reborn is really the big drawback, I guess you could say, of this game, which turns off a lot of new players. So how did I get into the game? Where did I first hear about it? And how did it kind of go from there? So first of all, I used to play a lot of Dota back in the day, and I had a friend of mine who was really into MMOs as well. Now, I wasn't really a big MMO player at all. I was more of a action-oriented game player, like MOBAs, that kind of stuff. But when it came to MMOs, I definitely didn't play that many of them. Like, I tried World of Warcraft, didn't like it at all, mainly because of the graphics. I've tried WildStar, but after about a month of playing, I didn't really play much of that either. And because it was a subscription-based game as well, it wasn't necessarily something that I quite liked playing, because I didn't have a lot of money that I could spend every month back then, because I wasn't working, of course, I was still going to school. And I didn't really like doing vacation work or weekend work, that kind of stuff. So me having to pay every month for a game was something that I didn't really do, especially not back then when I first heard about the game. Now, of course, A Realm Reborn ended, no, not A Realm Reborn, 1.0 ended up being a gigantic failure, so kind of happy that I didn't try out the game at first when it first came out. But fast forward a few years, me and my friends went to Germany to Gamescom, and Heavensward had just come out a few months prior to that, and they were showing off the game with the Ravana fight, which I hadn't really played much endgame MMOs, of course. Like, I did try World of Warcraft and WildStar, but I never really got past the first few hours into the game. WildStar I did play like to level 20 or 30 or something, but again, I didn't really reach endgame, so actually doing those big boss fights was something that I'd never really experienced myself or seen, because I didn't really look into the fights that much either. So seeing Ravana being done looked really cool and got me kind of interested in the game. Now, at that point in time, I was also somebody that jumped in between games quite a bit. Somebody that always liked indie games quite a bit as well, but most indie games don't take up that huge amount of a time span. It's usually just a single player game that you play for a few hours and then you're done with it. So back then, when we got back home, I was still playing the games that I played back then. But then once I was finally done with one of the games that I was playing and I was a little bit bored and I was thinking of what next game I should play, I kind of thought to myself, hey, that Final Fantasy game that we saw at Gamescom looked pretty cool. Let's go try that out, shall we? So went on, found out there was a free trial available for 2 weeks. Back then the trial was only 2 weeks. Right now it's pretty much indefinitely, but you only go up to like level 35 or something. So being able to play the game for 2 weeks, I was like, you know what, let's try this out. So I made my character, Emil Mikote, started out as an Arcanist, which I thought the carbuncles were really cute. And I loaded into Limsal Minsa, which in my opinion is one of the best starting cities out there, because it has that big open view of the sea and stuff like that. And back when I was a kid, we used to go to the sea like a few times a year as well. So it was a pretty good starting city for me. And after being introduced to the story, introduced to some of the characters there, a little bit of the world, you get asked to go slay some squirrels or whatever else it might have been, like some small low-level critters. We went outside, started attacking one of those, and I'm like, this thing takes 2.5 seconds to cast. That's quite long. And then I took a look at all of my other abilities, and I'm like, wait, a lot of these abilities also take 2.5 seconds. And then I asked my friend, because he did play a lot more back then, does it get faster? And he said, yeah, there's skill speed and spell speed, and it affects how fast you go. So I was like, okay, let's try and find maybe about like some level 50, level 60 endgame fights back then or something like that. So I looked up some fights, looked at what they were doing, and I'm like, wait, even their skills all share the same cooldown, and it's all on that 2.5 second cooldown. That's really long, and that felt really boring to me, so I pretty much immediately stopped playing the game. Until a friend of mine, or the same friend, said maybe you should try a physical job, because they don't have cast times. They still have that GCD, but they at least don't have the cast time. So I tried it out, started playing Dragoon, and didn't really click with me either. played it to like level 20 or something, and then I pretty much stopped playing again, until a few weeks later I was playing some kind of a turn-based game. I don't really remember which one it was, but it did make me remember that most of the old Final Fantasy games all used to be turn-based games, so I decided to try and go into the game with that mentality in mind. So I made myself a thaumaturge, which later becomes a black mage, and I kind of looked at it as a turn-based game, like me taking an action, then the mob that I was attacking taking an action, and it just kind of being more of a real-time turn-based game, if it makes any sense. Of course, Final Fantasy XIV is not a turn-based game at all. It's very different from that, but at least that was kind of the mentality that I went into when I first started playing the game again. And it kind of worked. I played for about a month until my subscription ran out, got to level like 32 I think, before I stopped playing. Of course I didn't unlock Black Mage because I didn't really know that jobs were a thing back then, so I was still level 32 Thaumaturge. But then eventually my subscription ran out and I wasn't really hooked, so I decided to just leave it at that and stop playing the game completely. So that's pretty much where my first introduction to Final Fantasy XIV kinda stopped, and I lost all interest in the game as well. Now, fast forward a year, I'm in Japan with a couple of my friends, and an old buddy that I used to play Dota 2 with started playing World of Warcraft on a private server, and he invited me to come join him. The server was running on Wrath of the Lich King, which is an old expansion, so the graphics were still shit. Don't really think World of Warcraft looks that great now, because the graphics just aren't for me. But the graphics from Wrath of the Lich King are really bad, so when I started playing with him, I was like, can you just give me a class that just has the coolest animations or whatever, or that's just really fun to play, because the game really doesn't look that great at all. So he told me to try Fire Mage because it's something that he played, he thought it was really fun. So I decided to try it out, and I thought it was kind of okay, but the more I played that Fire Mage and the more skills I unlocked, the more I started thinking back on my Black Mage and how I kind of started to miss it as well, because the more I played, the more I wanted to go back to playing Final Fantasy and that Black Mage. So back then I went onto YouTube, looked up some stuff about Final Fantasy, saw that Palace of the Dead had just come out, and that is pretty much one of the reasons why I was able to stick to this game, Palace of the Dead. So I went back into the game, played my Black Mage up to level 38, this time I did unlock the Black Mage. I'm a little bit unfortunate that I didn't go to level 40, because at level 40 is where Black Mage really comes into its own, or at least finally starts to feel good. But went to 38, got bored of it, and then I decided to unlock all of the different classes in the game, go into Palace of the Dead with every single one of them, go from 1 to 50 to at least unlock all of the skills, or most of the skills from the class, not from the job, and then basically go from there, try out everything and see what I thought was the most fun. Eventually I ended up sticking with Ninja, because Ninja did feel kinda cool and I liked the way that the Mudra system worked a lot. And Ninja is still one of my, well, probably my favorite melee in the game, and one of my favorite DPS to play as well. So that's pretty much why I kinda ended up sticking with Ninja, because I thought it was pretty cool in Palace of the Dead, and then I basically went all the way to max level, which was level 60 back then, on that Ninja as well. So that's kind of how I got into the game. Now, if I look onto kind of my advice for players that are new to Final Fantasy, are thinking about getting into the game but that aren't quite sure, or that are being put off about what is there in A Realm Reborn, because I have to be honest, when you start out playing the game as a new player, it's really shit. A Realm Reborn is very lengthy. It is also the most boring part of the game to play as like an actual player, because you don't have many skills because of skill pruning that went on in Stormblood and Shadowbringers. A lot of the other skills that you used to have back then are now gone because they didn't really serve a purpose at endgame. So because of that, the classes feel even more empty than they used to do back then. So a newer player experience I think is really bad for this game. So if you're a newer player, try to kind of look at it like this. And I like to compare Final Fantasy to this beautiful girl that looks really cool on the outside but has a very bad personality on the inside. But once you get to know her, she opens up to you and becomes a much nicer and much better person. And it's kind of the same with this game. The graphics are really good, I think that the game looks beautiful, and the story is quite nice as well, but you do really need to give it time to open up to you, to give you more skills of the job that you're playing, and to give it some time in the story as well, because A Realm Reborn is really lengthy and really boring at times as well. but it does pick up when you get into Heavensward. Stormblood was pretty alright as well, but then the Shadowbringer story was amazing and is still my favorite part of the story of this whole game. I think Shadowbringers was amazing, so give it some time. The beginning is going to be probably a struggle for most of the players that start out in this game, because your jobs feel like shit to play and the story might not be super engaging. But once you do finally get all the way up to the end, to that Shadowbringer story where the story is amazing and where your jobs really start to come together, that is where this game really takes like the cake for me. Like, it's a really cool game. It is my favorite game of all time, and it's definitely something that, even though it's very hard to get into, it definitely pays off if you decide to stick with it. So that's kind of my advice for newer players. If you do think about getting into the game, definitely don't buy the story skip, because you do kind of want to know all of the story for some stuff that goes on into Shadowbringers as well, because there's a lot of throwbacks to stuff that goes on in A Realm Reborn and Heavensward. So definitely don't skip all the story, but if you do get into it and you're struggling at the beginning, just try to stick to the game, try to get through it, because once you do, you are rewarded with this magnificent game and story in Shadowbringers. So that's pretty much what I want to talk about today, kind of talk about my experience starting the game and how it was really hard for me to get into it, but once I did make it all the way to the end, it was definitely worth the struggle. So that's gonna be it for me. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.